All right, so we'll get started. My name is Neil Stevenson. Great to be here this morning and to just acknowledge that we are meeting today on the ancestral territories of the Tsawwassen First People and other Hunkaminam speaking people and Musqueam people. And we are particularly grateful myself for the sun this morning and the beautiful blue sky, and grateful just to be in this beautiful place that we get to live and work and play. And we do just give our respects to those who have been here for generations. And I'm going to pass it over to Jason Hodgins, who's going to take it from here.
Hi everyone, thrilled to see so many people here and some short text experts that are part of our team and some other folks joining for the first time. So it's great to be part of this with you. What we're going to talk about today is working with short texts, as you all know. And really what we're wondering is if short texts are really an underutilized tool, something that we don't use enough of and don't get enough benefit from. And so we're thinking about it really as this opportunity with short text for all readers to engage in reading of complex text. And that's what we kind of want to hold as we go through today. As we're talking about literacy this year, we as a team, we've been landing on these three lights that we've been sharing with folks because we really think they help ground us. And so the three lights are admiration, experience, and proficiency, as you'll see. And they're really, the idea is that we need to shine all of them. And the cool part, I think, is that this short text work really holds all of these lights. And so just really quickly, the admiration light is about believing in all kids and about believing in ourselves as teachers. And what short text is really saying is that all kids can be readers and all kids can get better at readers, and that all kids have something to offer to their peers in the co-processing of reading and in the making sense of what they're reading. So that's an affirming light. And there's also the experience light, and the experience light just reminds us that kids' experience with a text or with a task that we've given them is really influenced by everything that's come before it. But the experience light also goes both ways, because it reminds us that when we can create success in the moment for kids, that we have a chance to change their future story. So the experience light is really calling on us as teachers to think about how we're architects of a present where kids feel successful and where kids are successful and where kids are growing and learning, and really researchers into how those moments are changing the story for those kids, especially our kids who might otherwise be struggling with reading. And then the final light is the proficiency light. And as we think about the proficiencies that are involved in reading, these are the ones that we're talking about as a team. And we are particularly thinking with short text on the right-hand side of this proficiency double wheel, which is in the vocabulary and the background knowledge side, and the opportunity of using short text to really develop kids' vocabulary and also background knowledge, both through the text work and also to help kids develop the vocabulary and background knowledge ahead of time so that they're prepared to engage in the short text work. So you'll see that as we go through the framework. So that's just a little bit about holding these three lights. And the beautiful thing, that the metaphor that we're using is this of additive color mixing. Because when you shine light together, if you shine different colors of light together, shining multiple colors of light doesn't lead to darker, like brown. Like if we mix paint, we mix multiple colors of paint, we get closer to brown and black, which are wonderful colors for painting. They're not great colors for seeing clearly, right? But the beautiful thing about light color mixing is the more colors you add, the closer you get to pure white light, which of course kind of fully illuminates things. So we hope that through this short text work, we have a chance to really engage and fully see kids and also really support kids in their whole selves as readers. Okay, so that's our background. That's kind of how short text fits into the broader picture of literacy. And as we think about it, we're really also grounding our short text work in this idea of reading and writing as a self-extending system. And that's an idea that has been with us for quite a while in education. Marie Clay first talked about it, and other people have talked about it as well, but it's just, this is how we're thinking about it. That the more learners read and write, the more opportunities they have within text, right? The more things they encounter, the more complexity they encounter, the more concepts, the more words. And as they encounter those things, as they're reading and writing, they If they're successful with them, then they feel successful. They are successful using their skills and strategies and the knowledge and the vocabulary that they bring. And as they go from there, from those successful experiences, their knowledge and their vocabulary and their word recognition, their ability to read all improve, right? And that has a lovely self-reinforcing moment where now kids are reading and writing more. And then they're, of course, encountering more, being more successful, and on it goes. So that's the ideal situation. That's what works for a lot of our kids. That's what worked for most of us in our own reading journeys. But of course, for some kids, it breaks down, right? And we think the place that it really breaks down for them is in the encounters that they have and the level of success that they have. If they're not able to have success in the reading that they're doing, then they're not more successful, they don't feel more successful, and they don't read and write more, right? So it becomes that negative circle too quite easily. So this short text work is really trying to intervene in that circle and make sure that kids are successful when they're encountering the texts that we're asking them to read. I love this metaphor of the fence, because I think it kind of applies to this short text work a lot and how we often kind of initially engage with it. But really, if we accept the idea that to get better at something, you got to do something that's harder than what you're currently able to do, right? You got to stretch yourself. But there's also too much stretches at times. And so as teachers, we're always kind of constantly making decisions about where to put up fences and where to let kids roam free, right? And we're trying to walk this balance of how much complexity is worth letting kids explore, and how much do we need to kind of protect kids from complexity in order to ensure their success. And so really the fence that I think we're bumping up against is the idea of just right books, right? This is kind of like universal dogma in education that's hard to, and certainly in literacy, that's really hard to talk about anything without reading. It's hard to pick up a literacy book without somebody referencing this idea of just right and instructional level books. I've got a pile here and it's in, I think, all of them. And it's not just that just right books aren't a useful concept and a useful idea, but I think what we want to just take a few minutes to think about is when just right texts really matter and when they might actually be getting in the way. So as we think about just right texts, there's a couple places where we think they really do matter. One of them is when kids are independently reading. So we put on there on the left-hand side our iPick bookmark for intermediate, and you'll see just the steps that we would recommend. Most of this comes from the language of the Daily Five, but we just like the language of like, kids are choosing books, they need to choose based on what their purpose is, what they're interested in. But they also need to be thinking about, when I read it, is it making sense to me? And they need to be thinking about, when I read it, do I know enough of the words, which is really linked to the comprehension piece. But notice that it says enough of the words, right? Because it's about what level of complexity they're willing to slog through for their purpose, right? If their purpose is just something fun to do on an afternoon, then it's maybe a different purpose. And I'm going to keep up with this book because my friend read it and I want to be able to talk with them about it, right? But just right books do matter in terms of independent reading when our kids are going to be reading on their own, for sure. Just right books also probably really matter at the early stages of reading acquisition. That at that grade 1, 2, particularly early grade 1 level, when kids are just learning how to decode words. And they're basically, if they don't know the word, they're kind of stuck on the word by word decoding, right? Because they don't have an automatic word vocabulary yet. And so at those stages, we do really want to make sure that they have a steady diet of books that are within their grasp, right? Books that they have the phonics knowledge to decode, books that they have the decoding skills to tackle those words. Now, it turns out from the research that we could probably stretch that so it's not a diet of exclusively texts that are within their instructional level, but certainly we think they do need lots of text at their instructional level. And because if they don't, if we're giving them too much complexity, there's a risk, one, that they'll get turned off for reading and they'll just be like, this is not for me, it's too hard, don't like it. And the second risk is that they might develop some really bad habits, some habits of just guessing at words and thinking that reading is just about guessing, or other habits of thinking about reading is just a completion task, like I just have to read to the end of the book and then I'm done. Not reading as a sense-making task that I need to pause when it's not making sense and reread and figure it out, right? So we do think just right texts matter there. But just right texts also have a problem, right? So a couple things that I've found interesting diving into this work. One of them is that accuracy level, we talk about 90% or 85%, or some people even say 95% for instructional level. It's actually arbitrary. There's no research behind any of those numbers. None of them, there's no research that says any of those numbers actually maximize reading growth. Okay? So we can let go of that idea. The second piece that's the problem with just right text is your capacity for complexity is really purpose, interest, and knowledge dependent, right? One person's capacity to pick up and read a book and get meaning from it is different than the person beside them, even though they might be at very similar places in their reading journey. The other problem with just right text is if they're too easy, then there's not enough stretch points, there's not enough growth points, right? And that a steady diet of instructional texts might actually slow reading growth is the other thing that should really have us concerned. So take a look at this study. This was a study from 2000, and they did a study of dyad reading for 5 months. Kids worked with a partner, and there was a struggling reader paired with a pretty fluent reader. And they were placed into 3 different groups, either instructional level, 2 grade levels above, in 3 different groups in terms of the text complexity they were reading. So they were either reading an instructional level book with a partner who could read that book. They were reading a book 2 grade levels above their with a partner, or they were reading 4 grade levels above. And what they did is they sat with their partner and they did this thing called dyad reading, which is actually a really cool fluency structure for anyone who's interested in another routine to add to your day. What you do is 2 readers read, but they share a text. And they don't just sit and the fluent reader doesn't read to the more struggling or striving reader. They both read it together. So you can think kind of about like running the hurdles. It's like somebody's there to give you a little boost whenever you get to a hurdle that you're not quite able to manage on your own, is basically how it works. Because both readers read, but the fluent reader carries through any of the challenges. And the job on the other person who's following along or reading with them is to say the word as well, but say it just a hair fraction after the fluent reader has said it. So that's dyad reading. And what they found when they did this for just 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, I think. This was the results of instructional level. Pretty actually impressive. Those kids gained about 1.5 years of reading growth. These kids, by the way, started at the very, very early stages of reading. They were end of kindergarten, beginning grade 1, kind of very, very beginning readers. They gained 1.5 years of growth in 5 months. Like, that's pretty amazing, right? But check out what happened to the kids who were reading 2 grade levels above. And here's kids that were reading 4 grade levels above. So a couple things to take away that we hope you'll take away from this. One of them is that texts above instructional level actually accelerated growth. So that's something important to hang on to. The other thing to notice is that readers were scaffolded into that complex text. We didn't just give them a pile of complexity and say, good luck with that, we hope you do well. They had another person reading with them. But readers weren't, they were scaffolded in, but they were also carrying the load themselves, right? They weren't fully scaffolded in where they didn't have to do any work. They were still working to read those texts too. And the other thing to notice is that this was one piece of the overall reading experience. And really, that's how we're thinking about the short text work as well. This is one piece of the overall literacy experience that our kids have in classes. It's not everything. Of course, there's another problem with just right text that you guys are all living every day. It's that you got diverse classrooms, right? With kids all over the place. And trying to match kids to text and have enough text to match the diversity of readers in your classroom, is an almost impossible challenge. So as we think about today, this is really the invitation. It's to think about trading text length for text complexity, right? Because it's kind of like the analogy of fitness. I can go for a walk for an hour, right? And burn about 350 calories maybe and get some fresh air and feel good and build a little bit of muscle. Or I could do some rock climbing for an hour if I were so inclined. Except not an hour, I could do rock climbing for about 25 minutes and burn about the same amount, probably build more muscle and gain more strength. Or I could do some interval training for about 12 minutes and get about the same benefit. So that's kind of the opportunity we're talking about with short text. Something kids can engage with. It's hard, it might be complex for a bit, but then we give them a little bit of a pause and they get to kind of go and do it again. So short text, we think they've got a lot of advantages. First of all, if it's short, we can scaffold complexity, right? We can front load kids' vocabulary. We can build their background knowledge for the things that are in that text. We can unpack complex sentences with them. We can reread the whole text, not just reread a sentence or reread a paragraph. We can reread the whole text in a way that we can't like reread a novel, right? And we can have lots of collaborative discussions about those short texts because we're not spending all of our time reading, where reading takes 5 to 10 minutes. Right? There's another affordance of short text that's really important to think about too, is that because we're not spending as much time in a text, we've got the opportunity for a wider selection of both genres and text structures, authors, diversity of authors, all those kinds of things. It's easier to connect to more student interests that way because each text can be about something different, or our themes can be about different things. And a collection of short texts, if we're going to put a collection together, can really help kids build their background knowledge and vocabulary on that topic or area. Okay. And the third affordance of short text is they really, we think, help us build a learning community because they act as those shared texts that everybody can read, but they're actually accessible that everybody can read. So all kids can share in the act of comprehension when they're working with a short text. They can all explore a topic or idea together, and they can build their vocabulary and understanding. Okay, so that was a lot for me. That's our background. That's our pitch. That's what we're working on. That's the why. So what we'd like you to do in a couple of small groups, in a small group with a pair or maybe three, is just think about what we've been saying so far. What has you intrigued? What brought you here today? And what questions do you have that you're kind of wrestling? Okay. Say it again. Welcome back. We hope you had some good conversations in your small group. Certainly have some questions. If you have some questions that you want to pop into the chat to make sure we kind of hit as we go through, we would welcome those, and we'll do our best to kind of keep track of those and do that. But yeah, we will. So We're going to talk specifically about the framework that we've been working on. But just before we do that, we'll just kind of make sure we're on the same page about what we mean by a short text. So here we go. Short text is just 1 or 2 pages. It could be fiction, but it could also be a poem or a song, or it could be nonfiction. So anything's kind of available and open, but it's a text that can be read pretty quickly, 5 to 15 minutes at the max. Most of the texts we tend to be working with are more in the 4 to 7 minute kind of range. But anyway, that's what we mean by text. So we're finding them in lots of different places, lots of opportunities. Of course, you might have some kicking around at the school in grade level textbooks or anthologies, new or old ones, because even if the binding on it is terrible, there might be some treasures in there. You know, even if the next story is a terrible one about kids dressing up as cowboys and Indians or something like that, you can skip that short story and you can read the one after it that is actually good and appropriate. So do take a look at some of those anthologies and things that you might have around. We also pay for Focus Ed education resources. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec, but those are available. And then there's some free digital sources on the internet. These are the things that are available through Focus Ed. This is what used to be called ERAC. I got to be honest, it's a pain in the butt to get into, but there is gold in there if you can make your way in. You'll need to get in through your school library as part of the handout today that was in the chat. There is a link to a document for helping you access Focus Ed. But once you're in there, you can search through these sources, and the kids magazines at the bottom. Focus Ed actually gives us access to pretty much every kids magazine that's published in North America. And it pulls out an article at a time. So it doesn't just give you the whole magazine. You can get the article and download a PDF of it. And then you've got a full color magazine article. So Focus Ed, it's a bit of a pain. It can be worth it, especially if you're looking for something specific, and also especially if you're looking for something with Canadian content, because there's a number of Canadian magazines that are in there. Another source of short text are these free digital sources that are on the internet. These are the big 3 that we're using a lot. We've got Common Lit, ReadWorks, and Newsela. All of these will ask you to sign up for an account, but it's a free teacher account. They all also have the feature of student accounts. For that, you would need student or parent permission because student accounts involve sharing some personal information with those sites and storing some personal information on those sites. But you as a teacher can have a teacher account, and your teacher account gives you full access to the texts on these accounts. So students don't need accounts. They only need accounts if you want them to read it online and answer their comprehension questions. That's actually not the model we're using anyways. So for our purposes today of working with short text in classrooms, they don't need student accounts, but you will need a teacher account in order to download and print them. And we're working on short text bundles that draw a lot from those 3 sources and also a few from Focus Ed. And we've got information about that on the website and in the handout. So more to come on that. As we return to this idea of the fence, I think it's helpful because I think it maybe helps us set up the framework that we're going to talk about. As I said, we're deciding all the time as teachers where to put up fences and where to protect kids. And as a system, we've conditioned ourselves to really think that safety comes from reducing text complexity, right? Or bypassing around text complexity so that our kids who are struggling don't have to engage in reading. They can just get to the sense-making part at the end. And it's true because there's a world beyond that fence that has hazards, but we can also think about the opportunities that are beyond that fence, right? And if we think about our kids, like we want all of them to be comfortable in complex, difficult text. That's what they're going to need to be able to navigate the world. And the analogy is you can't learn to scale cliffs and get across ice fields if we're always staying on the safe side of the fence. So I want you to just think for a moment about what you would want to be in place if you were to venture or send someone beyond the boundary. I'm going to suggest that you'd probably want to be prepared with equipment, knowledge, supplies, right? You'd also probably want to go with a guide, someone who's been there before or done something like this before. And then the third piece you'd probably want is you'd probably want a group to go with, right? Because that's going to be more fun, it's going to be more interesting, and you're going to learn from them because they're going to be learning alongside you. So if you think about that, that's really, I think, a helpful way to think about what this framework is. This is our framework for working with short texts. It's built around a before reading, during reading, and an after reading stage. And there's a couple things that happen in each phase. So it's kind of a 6-part framework. And so before reading, we're going to do a couple of things with kids. Before reading, we're going to read the text and we're going to anticipate what's there in the text that's going to be hard for kids. What are the barriers? What are the things that kids would really help kids to understand before they're asked to get out there beyond the fence? So we're going to work with vocabulary, maybe language structures, and knowledge. Before reading, we're also going to do another really important step. We're going to think about our most striving readers in the class, and we're going to make sure they are equipped for the during reading phase, right? Some kids are going to need a little extra attention before reading. So we're going to give those specific kids some pre-experience. They're going to read it again. They're going to read it ahead of time, maybe. They're going to read an easier version of the text. They're going to do reading with an adult ahead of time. Or they're going to listen to an audio version and maybe read along with that audio version, but they're going to have a chance to experience the text ahead of time. That's a really important pre-step that we think is part of this framework. All that pre-work lets us have a during reading experience where all readers, everyone in your class, is reading the same text at the same time on their own. Right? That's the invitation, that they're all reading. And then to get them reading and rereading, we select reading routines where they are talking about the reading with each other, where they're all bringing their ideas to it, and where it drives them back to reread the text. In that during reading time, we're also going to make sure as teachers, as the expert guides, that we point out the things in the text that we might not have got to in the pre-reading, the before reading, but we can in the during reading, the things that will help kids understand. So any vocabulary that the author has chosen to explain within the text. Maybe it's a language structure that's really important that kids grasp and figure out, or maybe it's focusing on the new knowledge that they're building as they read. Okay. So we have a fancy word for that called affordances. I'll talk about that in a sec. In the after reading phase, it's kind of 2 parts. The after reading phase is the only one that's actually separated by 2 different times, because the first one is just the closure. We're going to bring this during reading to an end, just like we all learned in teacher education programs. Like we got to have some kind of closure, bring it to something. That's where we're just thinking about something short and bring it to a close. But then there's this second after reading phase, which is the recall and the revisit. And in the recall and the revisit phase, we're going to wait a day or 2, and then we're going to come back to the ideas and the vocabulary. Because this is where we've really got a chance to, if they learned and encountered new vocabulary in the text, to reinforce that and make those connections stronger in the recall and revisit, right? Because when we come back to an idea, that it's more likely that we retain it over time. Okay, so that's the outline of the structure. So we're going to get a chance to experience that. I've got a text here for you, and it's a text from one of those free sources on the internet, but I've given you the PDF link. And let me just put it in the chat in a sec. As you get into that text, here's what we're inviting you to do. To read it and look for vocabulary that might get in the way for kids. Look for language structures that might be hard. That includes how the text itself is structured. Look for knowledge that kids might need in order to actually get something or get the most out of the text. Okay. Just a quick word about the word affordances. Affordances and barriers are kind of the same thing. So a barrier is something, of course, that makes it hard. An affordance is something that might be a challenge, but when you get it, when it's there, when you take advantage of it, it contributes to meaning. And the cool thing about that idea, I think, is that challenges in text aren't there because the author was a bad author. They're there because they contribute to meaning, right? The author's assuming that we're able to navigate them. And if we get them, then all of a sudden it opens up what the author's trying to say to us. So affordances are just those things that if we take advantage of them, we can make sense of them. So be on the lookout for those as you read this text as well. Okay, here's the text in the chat. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to read it and just be thinking about what the barriers to comprehension are. come back together and just be thinking about what barriers you noticed. We can think about barriers as like pretty high walls, and what affordances, what felt like steps that most of your kids might be able to take in the text. And if there's certainly some of both in there. As we think about that idea, I like this image because it's the idea that affordances and barriers are really kind of the same thing, right? Something can be an affordance or it can be a barrier. Yeah, and thanks, Alan's contributed the meaning of immigrants, oxygen. Yeah, some people are adding some things to the chat, so thanks for doing that. That's awesome. Yeah, makes sense. So this idea of barriers, like that rock wall there could be a barrier for kids or for readers. But if they're able to negotiate it with the strength they've got or with choosing the right route, then it becomes an affordance too, because that can also be something that lets them get higher in their understanding and ability than if it wasn't there, right? So I like that image for just thinking about this kind of interplay between barriers and affordances. Yeah, so people are naming some vocabulary, knowledge, for sure. A word like camouflage. Thanks, everybody. Okay. So as we think about this text and think about planning for it, we're into this stage, oops, of barriers and affordances, right? And addressing those. So we want to address these with the whole class before reading with everybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to plan to address one or two of them. Now, we're not actually going to address all the barriers because we're reading complex text. We're not going to be able to do all of them. We need to figure out which ones are most important, which ones we have the greatest opportunity to help the most of our readers. So we're going to plan to address one or two of them ahead of the lesson. So as we think about this example, we could do something like this. We could do a semantic gradient with two words that are kind of important and are not explained by the author, the poet. Those words might be toil and seek. You might have noticed those. They're not explained. They're not there in the text. But if you don't know what the word toil means, or you don't know what the word seek means, then you're kind of at a disadvantage. So there's lots of words, though, that kids will know that are synonyms of toil, and lots of words that kids know that are synonyms for seek. So they could do that, and you could do this activity of semantic gradients where you generate a whole bunch of synonyms, and then kids work together to try to put those synonyms in an order that makes sense to them. Okay? So the important thing to note here is the teacher can be really involved in generating the synonyms, but then the kids are doing the sense making of talking about the words and putting them in. Yeah. So that's one great thing to do. Another idea that people talked about, like the knowledge idea, like if kids don't know much about amphibians, then that's going to be really hard for them. So as a teacher, I might choose to do a virtual field trip and a video that's maybe narrated or not, and plan some pre and during and post activities just with the video to really build some background knowledge about what it means to be an amphibian, where amphibians live, what's unique about amphibians, what their life cycle's like, those kinds of things. Okay. So that's step one of the reading framework. Step two of the short text framework is to plan and provide some pre-experiences specific students. Because as important as that step one is, that's for every kid. But some of my kids might still not be prepared for the complexity of the text I'm about to hand out. So it's really important that we don't skip this step, that our kids who might otherwise struggle get a chance to do that. So for this specific example, that we've done, we're going to do some advanced reading. So some of those kids are going to get a chance to read it ahead of time. They'll take it home, particularly for kids that maybe take a little longer for processing, give them a chance to get a head start, right? And the other thing we'll do for our readers who are really struggling is get them reading with an adult, where they're reading along with the adult, similar to the dyad reading that we talked about in that study earlier. So step three of the short text framework is to figure out an active reading routine, something that I can use with the text and something that is going to get kids rereading for a purpose. So this is our heuristic. The active reading routines, we have a bunch of them that we're sharing and testing out in a bunch of classrooms in Delta, some of whom are joining us today. But they all kind of follow this basic pattern. The first thing of the active reading routine is that everybody reads, right? We pass it. This is where we've done the pre-work. So now everyone's equipped. We can give the text to everybody. We don't have to make any distinction between who gets the text and who doesn't, who partner reads and who doesn't. Everybody reads. And then we don't just leave them with that reading. We invite them with the active reading routine to reread the text for a particular purpose, right? So we give them the thinking tool or the thing we want them to do, and they reread it. And then we get them talking to a small group of their peers about the tool and the text. And the routine keeps repeating that, sharing and then going back to the text, sharing and going back to the text, okay? So that's our heuristic that hopefully helps when you see the routines and when you're navigating them, helps you think about it. Okay. So here's some possible tasks. Is this some examples of what we do? One of them is a blank number of important words. So let's say the individual tasks that the kids do on their second read, because the first read, we let them read through it on their own. The second read, we're giving them a task as well as the text. So they might read the second time and they might select 5 important words, 5 words that they think are most important. Okay. They might also, then they would talk about those words with each other and share words and say, oh, why did you choose that word? And oh, I chose that word because it's over here. And this is what the author's saying or the poet's saying. So that's a really open-ended routine that kids can use. Another routine is, as a class, we would generate some comprehension questions, and then the kids would have the comprehension questions. They would choose which ones they want and go back to the text to reread with those comprehension questions in mind. That's another routine. Another routine might be inferring about the author, or it might be completing a graphic organizer. So for this particular text, when we looked at it, we thought a graphic organizer might make the most sense. So we chose a Venn diagram because a Venn diagram, has the idea, could hold the idea of the experience of immigration and amphibians. And so because the text structure is that alternating text structure that people noticed, that's a hard structure in and of itself, let alone the idea that Kimberly mentioned of comparing immigrants to amphibians. Like, that's pretty abstract. So we thought maybe a Venn diagram would help kids unpack that. So we could actually give them an extra copy of the text. They could cut it up, and then they could sort the lines according to where they think the line is talking about amphibians, where it's talking about immigration, and where it might be talking about both. Okay. So that would be a routine that could generate a lot of discussion. Kids could do that on their own. Then they could share with a partner, see what they got, talk about why they put the lines of text where they did it. Now just notice that doing that routine accomplishes this, right? It accomplishes them reading it on their own first. It accomplishes them rereading it with a purpose. And then it accomplishes them sharing with a partner and revisiting what they've read, what they've done, and also what they've read. They got to keep reading those lines of text to place them around. So that's the idea of the active reading routine. Now, Tina has noticed that there's some affordances that are present in the text. The text happen to include footnotes and for some of the language that's in there. So that's something that we would also really want to do, is make sure that kids noticed those affordances that are present in the text. Make sure that they notice the text structure and how the author is comparing immigrants and amphibians in a very intentional way. Make sure they notice that the author is using rain as a metaphor and an analogy would be another affordance. Once they get that, oh, okay, that makes more sense. If they just think it's just about rain falling from the sky, then that's the idea of affordances, that once you pick them up, they actually enable you to make sense of the text that you're reading. Okay, step 5 is just a little bit of closure and then a follow-up experience on a subsequent day. So in step 5, there's that consolidate and connect. There's that, we're just going to bring it to a close somehow. So maybe a little bit of brief writing, maybe some synthesis, maybe here's where we might bridge into a personal response. Because one of the things we're really trying to do in the during reading section is avoid getting into the personal response too quickly, because that takes us out of the text, right? Takes us into our own world and away from the idea of rereading and really engaging with what is in the text. So that's a place where it could fit. And then a couple days later, we're going to plan a recall and revisit strategy where we're going to ask kids what they remember, get them sharing and talking with each other or playing a game or an activity with what they remember. Or we're going to maybe give them a short text on the same topic, like not necessarily a full text. Maybe we just give them a quote, right? Maybe we give them a quote from somebody who's been through immigration and ask them to unpack that quote and make the links back to the experience that they had during reading. Okay, so here's just some examples. The most valuable phrase. Go back to the text and figure out which one do you think is the most important. So just a quick kind of circling or highlighting activity. So here's an example of a retell circle for the next day or the day after. They could get into a circle. Of course, it doesn't have to be a circle in times of COVID. If you want to just have retell partners and have them be the partner on the left and partner on the right, something like that, where they share the part. But the idea is that one person gets a chance to share, the other person listens, and the listener then gets to listen for accuracy and kind of add to it. And then the partners shift and the thing that they say changes, or the person talking changes. All right. Because But So is just a simple little writing routine that we've been using a lot with these short texts, where you give them a sentence stem and kids have to finish that sentence stem, starting with the words either because, but, or so, right? So immigration is like, is similar to as amphibians because, but, so. That wasn't a great sentence stem, but anyways, you get the idea. So that's the framework. It's got before reading, it's got during reading, 2 steps, and it's got after reading. And what we've done with this framework is we've turned it into some short text bundles that are available on the website. And the link to the website is in the chat, and we'll put it in there again in a minute probably, or maybe one of my colleagues can do that. But we've produced some bundles because we know it's actually a ton of work to find these texts. And so we've produced some bundles, and we have got some teachers testing them out because we kind of needed some proof of concept, right? We needed to know that that this could actually work in real classrooms and not just on paper. So we've got an amazing group of teachers who's been working on this. Some of them are even here today. So thanks so much for being here and hearing this again, because they've all heard this at least once, maybe twice now. But yeah, this is some of the feedback that they've given as they work with these bundles of short text in their classrooms. Okay, so Neil has placed the link to the handout for today into the, oops, that is not what I was intending to do, into the chat. And if you open that, you're going to see a couple of things in there that you might want to explore for a couple minutes. One of them is the amphibians example. So we did a worked example of what that framework would look like with the amphibians text. So you can definitely check that out. And the other one that you can look at is what's called the blank planning framework, or what is a blank? It's a blank planning framework. And on that, what you'll see is an empty framework that teachers can use for planning. And on it is empty space. But below it, when you scroll down, you'll see all the routines, because I've shared a couple with you today, but there's a whole bunch more routines that we're actively using and exploring and thinking will be useful for this work. So there's a whole bunch of routines in that second document that you could look at to really help you with your own planning and your own work with short text. And then the third thing that you might want to look at, and you'll have time to probably look at one of these things, but the third thing you might want to look at is the link to the short text website, where we've started to publish bundles of short text for teachers in Delta, and really actually it's publicly available, so anyone in the world can use them if they want. But we're putting together bundles because we know that getting started with this work, a big part of the challenge is finding texts and then grouping them together in a way that makes sense. The selecting activities takes some thought, but it's not the hardest part. The hardest part often is finding the text. So check out any one of those three and take a couple minutes, and then we'll come back to close.